Maya kept the bell over the door chained during the worst of the winter rush and unchained it when the sun came out, but the bell never mattered the way the stories did. The shop sat 3 doors down from the laundromat in a strip that pretended to be historic and succeeded only in being stubborn, an unremarkable brick face of windows that always fogged with steam and old paper. Inside, the air smelled of oil, lemon polish, and paper, good smells for an antique businessman who believed objects remembered hands, even when the hands were long gone. She had named the place Memory Lane because the name made people forgive her for the dust. She had not named her life a mission, though she had considered it one more times than she liked to admit. She had a reputation for eclectic taste and a steady eye. People thought they were buying trinkets and taking home other people's memories. Maya thought she was saving them. She had started collecting medals the way other people collected postcards, casually, then habitually. Estate sales were her hunting grounds, and she had a small notebook full of notes about places and faces and the way a widow had brushed dust off a box of medals and said nothing. The first batch she purchased because they were cheap and pretty, the second because the widow did not want them, and the third because the estate liquidator had been blunt about nuclear families and clutter. They came in mismatched boxes, in pill tins, in envelopes with names half-typed and wrong addresses. Some were corroded, some shined like new. Some still had service folders attached, brittle with age, but most were anonymous as if the recipients had never existed at all. That was the idea that began to take shape in Maya's head, to put names to faceless medals. She did not plan a grand campaign. She pinned a brass plaque over a velvet cloth on an empty window one evening, deciding the display would be called Remember Them, in quiet letters. She arranged the medals by type, campaign ribbons in neat rows, purple hearts with small chips of enamel, a cluster of bronze stars mounted with the methodical care of someone who loved order. She placed a handful of tarnished, higher-grade medals in shadowed corners until she could figure out how to present them without seeming to claim ownership of an unknown life. She made small cards for each grouping with the words found, unknown, from estate sale. It was meant to be a respectful curiosity, a way to honor faceless service rather than a display of treasure. People noticed. At first it was the regulars, Mrs. Hensley from the bakery who liked stories of gallantry the way she liked her buns, and Tommy the college kid who flipped through military insignia while his girlfriend pretended she did not care. They would ask questions and then walk away with the ache of someone who had not known their grandfather had been in the Pacific. It warmed Maya in a way she had not expected. She kept adding medals. She kept writing notes in that same small notebook. The first ripple of controversy arrived with a man who called himself Lionel. He worked at the County Military Museum, a place that liked labels on everything and remembered the precise dates when flags had been folded. He had the posture of someone who had been the graduate of every course he'd ever taken. He came with a reporter and a camera, and he pronounced the display less than authoritatively. "This is sentimentalizing artifacts," he said, and the camera's red light blinked as if in agreement. The words were a challenge pegged with civic duty. Maya listened as people took sides like pressed flowers between pages, some whispering that Lionel was right, others scowling at him for spoiling something that felt right. He kept insisting medals belonged in context, in a controlled environment with catalog numbers and climate control. He implied, always politely, that Maya was romanticizing history the way a tourist romanticized war, equal parts ignorant and disrespectful. He had power that felt real to people who built careers around accuracy. He could, with one formal call, have a shipment embargoed or start an investigation into the provenance of an object. He made thin jokes about provenance over tea and then wrote columns about stewardship and public heritage. His comments drew attention, and attention brought scrutiny. The local paper ran a small piece that quoted him and used the word negligence in the headline. Maya started counting customers who did not return. She took to arriving before dawn to dust, to straighten, to rehearse in the quiet what she might say when Lionel found another way to humiliate what she was doing. She had a face for listening and not much of a face for pleading. People had always undercut Maya because she did not fit the expected profile of a collector. She was young enough to be mistaken for an assistant and female enough for people to assume sentimentality instead of expertise. The micro-assaults were common, cute display, said as if that were a compliment, or men lowering their voices and saying, "She means well," with the condescension of someone handing bread to a dog. It was the sort of invisible scorn that compacts into pressure over time, enough to make a person doubt the solidity of their own convictions. She had been raised by a man who would not tolerate theatrics and who shaped her like good metal. Her father had been a mechanic who taught her to look for faults by sound. He had not served in the military. He had served the same discipline of hands and machines, but he had told her, with the bluntness of a man who had loved and buried friends, that some debts were paid only by remembering. Honor, he had said one night when the two of them listened to a radio show about a forgotten veteran, is a quiet thing. You don't have to shout it to make it true. Her father's death had been a small private affray of grief that taught Maya how to hold silence like armor. The public commentary curdled into something heavier when Lionel circulated a letter to the city council, suggesting Maya's display be vetted by a committee. He used phrases like chain of custody and preservation protocol. He implied that a shop front was a liability, an invitation to theft and sacrilege. He used the language of expertise to turn moral condemnation into municipal procedure. The council, inclined to avoid controversy, appointed a subcommittee. They asked Maya to bring receipts, proofs of purchase, and any documentation she had. She presented the billfolds, estate sale receipts, and photographs of purchases. They were not satisfied. They wanted a provenance report, a chain of custody. Maya could not give what they wanted because no one had thought to make a chain out of these things in the first place. The medals had been dropped off in cardboard boxes like any other abandoned history. The subcommittee hearing became a small public spectacle. Mr. Lionel spoke for cleanliness and correctness, and his voice had that brittle edge of someone who believed that cleanliness was honor. Artifacts, he told the council, are not props to be used for community sentiment. The councilwoman with the good shoes asked technical questions. There were nods. There was polite curiosity about who allowed such things to be sold, and why. Maya found her throat dry and her palms steady. She did not cry. She did not beg. She said, simply, they were bought legally. I wanted people to see them. She did not say she had promised, quietly, in the small private chamber of a heart, that she would find anyone who had a right to remember them. The decision was a compromise that felt like a rebuke. Maya could keep the medals as long as she permitted the museum to conduct an inventory and verify any claims. Lionel would head the inventory, of course. He smiled the way a man smiled who knew he had cornered a fox without touching the fur. Maya accepted. She had no choice. She did not look him in the eye when she agreed, because there was a thinness to his victory that made her stomach hollow. They began the inventory one damp morning in the back of the shop, a space where sunlight slanted through dust motes and gave the walls a false sense of direction. Lionel brought a scanner, a clipboard, and a firmness that disapproved of clutter. He arranged the medals by his own taxonomy and started to pronounce what a collector had already suspected, that many of the items were unremarkable and without trace. He described the likely fates of medals after service, thrown into boxes, misfiled at county registries, lost in moves paid for by young men and women who did not think to leave records for families that would one day be confused. He said this as if it were scientific law. Maya watched him as if watching a tide. She kept quiet until he spoke about a small cluster, a pin set of silver that did not gleam like the rest, a flat star she had placed under cotton because it had been dented. He bent like a man examining the fine thread of a seam. This, he said, and the neutrally modulated voice of expertise tightened, is not likely to be significant. He pronounced, probably a unit commendation from a local outfit. The camera crew waited for a bite, for the confirmation that would make their footage neat. The reporters leaned forward. Maya's chest was practical, she had learned to breathe like a technician before she spoke. Whose? She asked, softly, more out of habit than hope. Lionel looked up like someone who had expected more flattery. The maker's mark indicates a contractor, he said. No recipient indicated. The answer satisfied other people. It did not satisfy her. She could read a mark on metal the way her father could read the cough of a carburetor. Something in the stamping did not fit Lionel's categorization. It had an angle that suggested naval tooling, not local, an artisan's tweak that could be placed in time and place if someone could be willing to dig. That someone turned out to be Dr. Daniel Hale, a military historian with patience for ink and bruised files. He arrived with credentials and a small gravity that made Lionel stiffen as if someone had corrected his posture. He had been in contact with Maya earlier, an email from a research address that had taken Lionel's complaints and the shop's defenses and added curiosity. He had read the newspaper pieces and thought those medals deserved better than being the battleground of two men in a strip mall. He came as an objective observer, though he had a personal history of patching gaps in service records and returning names to gravesides. Dr. Hale was not the sort of higher authority that followed a rank stripe, he identified with the discipline of scholarship and the mission of truth. He asked for permission to take a few pieces for closer inspection at his lab. Lionel wanted to refuse. He wanted to keep the control. But the council's compromise required documentation, and the documentation demanded scientific detail. Maya signed a release with hands that did not tremble and a small smile that was private. The medals were gone for a week. Lionel sat in his office and wrote detailed memos about protocols and liabilities. He sent emails to the city council about processes and standards. He publicized the issue as preservation. His angle earned him mentions and invitations to radio shows. He smiled into microphones the way people smile into glass, reflecting something that still looked like victory. And for a week the shop was quieter than it had been, which felt like a slow bruise. When Dr. Hale returned, the small bell at the front announced him like a distant bravo, and he did not come alone. He had with him a small cardboard box and a line of notes that were legal and tender. He sat at the counter, removed a medal, and set it on the felt cloth as if he were offering something that needed reverence. "This one," he said, "is not merely a unit insignia." Lionel's mouth tightened. Maya had the patience of someone who had stored coffins for a lifetime, she kept her face smooth. "There is an engraving, almost invisible from the front," Dr. Hale continued. He turned the medal and showed a tiny stamped initial buried in the lacing. "Private First Class James Barton, 1st Battalion, 1917, he read. It was a name and a year breathed back into the world. The shop stood in suspended breath. Customers who had drifted in that day watched as if a magician had produced an impossible coin. Lionel's expression shifted from professional superiority to something narrow and watchful. He had spoken in terms of inert objects, but here the object had become an emissary. Dr. Hale explained that he had cross-referenced the initials with service rolls, and a faded photograph in an archive matched the shape of a jaw and the tilt of a hat. There was a service number. There was a hometown in a small Midwestern town where a gravestone had been recorded, but the family contact had long been lost to a chain of moves. Dr. Hale's voice had the careful cadence of one who had reunited dogs and owners. It was thrill and duty and soft triumph. The first medal was only the beginning. One by one, the medals that had been written off as anonymous revealed marks, serial numbers, discolorations that mapped onto unit rosters. Dr. Hale moved through them with the devotion of someone whose work required him to be patient with the erosion of time. He found a Purple Heart that matched the injury report of a corporal who had not been recorded in the family files because his sister had remarried and kept the maiden name as if the past had not been allowed a voice. He matched a Navy Cross to a sailor whose records had been misfiled under a phonetically similar name, and the mistake had compounded every time an archivist tried to remedy it. Every revelation was a small act of excavation, a peel of varnish from a name. Word moved the way rivers move, slow at first, then purposeful and unstoppable. News vans arrived, but the story did not belong to a sensationalist narrative. It rested on the human geometry of rediscovery. Relatives who had no idea a father or grandfather had been decorated began to find their way to the shop with faces taut and hands in pockets, as if arriving at a wake for someone they had never been allowed to bury properly. They came to see medals they had not known existed and to ask questions that sheltered decades of rumor and shame. The community leaned in, and the peer group that had been whispering and smirking found their voices rethreaded with a new curiosity and a new humility. Lionel's tone hardened in public. He had been the critic who had warned of sloppy stewardship, now he risked being the critic who had been publicly wrong. He gave interviews that read as thin defenses, and the air around him grew cramped with the need to explain away the errors of assumption. He accused Dr. Hale, quietly, too quietly, of sloppy methodology and of rushing to conclusions. Dr. Hale countered with open notebooks and straightforward patience, offering to work with Lionel rather than against him. Lionel flicked his hand and, in doing so, revealed the part of him that had been blinded by the need to be first, to be the voice of authority. Not everyone sided with Maya from the beginning. Some of her peers in the antique trade had been amused by her stubbornness. They commented over coffee about how she had picked up wartime junk, and how the museum had been right to be cautious. Others, who had come to know her as a methodical buyer with a keen eye for provenance and an intuitive sense of history, offered their support in small gestures, extra shelving, a loaned magnifier, referrals to small-town archives. It mattered. In the slow build of vindication, the cluster of quiet helpers formed a net beneath what could have been an ugly fall. There were intimate scenes that needed tending. An old woman named Alice came in with a photograph folded in tissue and a veiled tremor in her voice. "My brother," she said, "he left when he was 20. We thought he might be buried under, unknown, somewhere." Maya had put Alice in a corner with a pot of tea and a chair that remembered the shape of someone older than the shop. Dr. Hale had sat across with a laptop and gentle questions, and then he placed a medal on the table and unfolded the tissue like a priest reading a small scripture. Alice's hands remembered the weight of a medal before her mind did. She touched the ribbon and sobbed in a way that was not shrill and was not theatrical, it was the right kind of grief, the grief of reunion. The shop felt, in that moment, like a sanctified place. Lionel observed these things in footage that trimmed the best parts for news cycles. He watched the web of recovery that had sprung from a collection he had derided and felt something he had not planned for, smallness. He doubled down. He spoke to the press about process and chain of custody again, but his words lacked their earlier ease. People began to question whether the museum's initial dismissal had been more about gatekeeping than stewardship. There were hushed conversations about whether expertise sometimes became a shield against acknowledging emotion and truth. One afternoon, weeks after the inventory had begun, Maya arrived at the shop to find a small crowd and a television set up in the window. Dr. Hale stood outside on a box with a group around him, reading names. The air felt like the inside of a bell, clear, resonant. He announced, with the precision of a man who knew he was making something right, that within the display were at least 3 medals that belonged to recipients of the Medal of Honor. The crowd exhaled as one and then inhaled into a new silence. Lionel stood off to the side, and his expression fractured in ways the camera caught with the cruel honesty of light. He looked like a man who had understood the world in gradations and then been shown a truth that rendered the gradations petty. The revelation triggered a tidal change. Families whose genealogies had been severed by moves and indifferent record-keeping found each other. Newspapers, official channels, and the Department of Defense reacted with a mixture of bureaucratic care and human astonishment. The medals could not have been used as evidence without strict verification, and Dr. Hale had prepared for that by forwarding his findings to military archives. Officers arrived, quiet, efficient, and unspectacular, bearing forms and an authority that made Lionel fold inward like paper left in rain. The highest authority arrived in the person of Colonel Emma Royce, who had command presence enough to make Lionel shrink from the grandeur of small men. She arrived not as an adversary but as a decisive hand on a fragile object. She was direct and terse, wanting to hear the facts and then, in crisp language, to make decisions. She listened to Dr. Hale, she looked at the medals, and she reviewed the initial report of Lionel's museum team. Colonel Royce did not care about personalities, she cared about justice and about the chain of memory. When she spoke, it was to lay out consequences in a way that left no room for equivocation. Lionel's conduct, his earlier dismissal and persistence in discrediting the display, was called into account. Those who had watched the slow construction of disgrace waited to see whether the higher authority would be another man of words who cared more for appearances than truth. They were not disappointed. Colonel Royce's assessment was swift and public. Lionel had acted beyond the museum's mandate when he sought to control access to artifacts for the sake of personal prestige. There was an inquiry, and the inquiry's findings were blunt. He had used his position to attempt to silence an earnest civilian effort to recover lost history. His motives had been described, by a committee of his peers, as compromised by the desire to be the gatekeeper of memory rather than the steward of it. The consequences were immediate and unmistakable. Lionel was relieved of his directorship pending the inquiry. He was reassigned to a role that involved cataloging files off-site in an unheated room where his authority narrowed into a box with a dim lamp. There was an official censure. There was no dramatic firing. The military bureaucracy preferred erasures by procedure to public spectacle. But the message was clear: arrogance without service could not be allowed to choke the work of returning names to their rightful place. Lionel's humiliation was precise and public. He could not wall the story with labels and folders anymore. Maya watched the consequences unfold without vindictiveness. She had no desire for spectacle. Her victory settled on her like a coat that had been mended and fitted by hands that understood the weight of winter. The higher authority's arrival had not been deus ex machina in the operatic sense, it had been a necessary correction where an individual had misused institutional power. She felt an odd pity for Lionel that she kept strictly internal. He had been the kind of man who needed to be first to justify his narrative of competence. The peer group changed, gradually then altogether. The local antique trade recognized the display not as sentimentality but as an active archive for forgotten histories. People who had been indifferent now brought boxes of medals to a shop that was becoming, improbably, a shrine. Families sent photographs, letters, saved diaries. Dr. Hale sat with Maya and transcribed names into files that would be sent to archives and to graveside committees. The shop's window lit at night with a respectful glow, and the medals were rearranged not as merchandise but as testimony. There was a scene of reconciliation that spoke more than words. A young man who had started as a doubter, the same college kid who had once flipped through insignia, came into the shop, hat in hand, and placed a small envelope on the counter. "My great-grandfather," he said, "I think one of these is his. I was embarrassed I ever thought it just junk." He extended the envelope with genuine apology and an attempt at restitution. He asked questions, and Maya answered with the precise patience she had learned from her father. The exchange was small, and it mattered. It was the peer group's olive branch, a sign that scorn had been turned into curiosity and, finally, into respect. There were private reckonings too. Lionel, reassigned, took his pride like a bandage on a wound he refused to dress. He sent polite letters that read like attempts to save face by invoking the letter of procedure. People in the town who had once admired his institutional language found themselves less engaged by the careful cadence of a man who had lost moral urgency. In hushed bars, people discussed gatekeepers and the thin brittle structures that sometimes protected nothing at all. Maya did not rest on the vindication. There was more work. For every medal identified, there were others with more complex trajectories. Some had names that led to dead ends because records had been destroyed in fires, some to ambiguities of adoption and remarriage. Dr. Hale taught her to read the small marks on ribbons, the twisted thread where a medal had once been altered to fit a civilian lapel. They mapped journeys across the map of a life, to ports, battlefields, armories. Every identification was a fact that spun the web tighter between communities and their missing pasts. A particular case had been stubborn, a medal of honor that no one could place. It was wrapped in a brown paper with a name rubbed away, the medal itself shining as if it had been polished by hands who thought it not yet ready to be claimed. Dr. Hale said the engraving pattern matched a batch sent to a remote regiment whose records had been scattered by bureaucratic reshuffling. He suggested a cross-reference with civilian shipping manifests. Maya had taken to midnight phone calls to distant towns, to librarians, and to sleepy clerks who delighted in the small successes of discovery. She found addresses and obituaries. She sent letters and emails and the occasional longhand note. She collected thanks as if they were part of the inventory now, a new ledger of returned memories. There were moments when she imagined her father alive, proud because she had turned a small instinct into the recovery of a truth. She did that quietly and without melodrama because she had been taught that honor did not require public sermonizing. When the medals became the subject of a regional exhibit, a traveling display that rooted donors' names beside photographs, Maya's shop became a hub. People came from far-off towns with stories folded into their pockets. The shrine quality was not manufactured. People brought candles and notes, sometimes a poem that told of a mother who had kept a wartime letter folded at the heel of a sock for 50 years. The atmosphere in the shop shifted from protective miscellany to an intentional archive. Maya catalogued in a ledger as carefully as any museum, but her entries differed because she wrote with the aim of reaching descendants and of setting records straight rather than of guarding objects behind glass. Her shop's credo became to honor names over nouns. She hired, finally, a young assistant with an archival background and a bright-eyed hunger to learn how stories could be kept from being lost. Together, they processed donations, scanned photos, and consulted with Dr. Hale on necessary verifications. The community's perception of her transformed. Children from the local school came on field trips to see the medals and learn about memory stewardship. They practiced reading names with a solemnity that surprised the teachers. Veterans came in to look, to remember their friends, to nod with the private recognition of men and women who had been in the noise and found a place to rest in silence. A plaque was dedicated in the shop's window not to Maya but to the forgotten names, and the town's mayor read a speech about memory and duty that the elderly gentleman in the front row applauded with hands that had known the exact rhythm of a salute. The final public reckoning arrived quietly and in a way that was almost domestic. Colonel Royce returned to the shop to deliver a formal commendation in a small ceremony of local dignity. She did not stand on a pedestal. She spoke briefly, in crisp declaratives, of a civic failure corrected by a civilian's diligence and the cooperation of scholarly discipline. She praised Maya's quiet resilience and the way the community had rallied. She announced, with a few simple notes, that the military would open a liaison office to assist with future provenance questions and that the museum's policies would be revised to encourage collaboration rather than control. Lionel was not at the ceremony. His name had been mentioned only in a factual paragraph of the archive. The absent antagonist had become a footnote, the absent healer, an institutional correction. Maya accepted the commendation with minimal words. Her face was steady because victory had never been her language, duty had been. She had faced quiet humiliation, public questioning, and the slow constriction of a man who would have been content to police memory. She had endured it all without display, no grand speeches, no dramatic confrontation. There was no need. The truth had unrolled itself in time, and the weight of authorities had finally been placed where it belonged. The shop retained its new sacred quality without changing its essential identity. It was still a place of dust and lemon polish, of half-curated chaos and deliberate care. But it was also a place where strangers met and found relation through a ribbon or a name. Families returned to gather medals, to hold and to place them in small wooden boxes. They took photographs for genealogy pages that had once been blank. They knelt quietly by graves where headstones once read only, unknown. They read names aloud like small triumphs. Stories proliferated like leaves in good weather. There was a boy from the Midwest who learned his grandfather's last name and then found a branch of family in a different state, lives that had been separated by decades and by a string of assumptions. There was a woman who finally carried a photograph to her brother's grave, where the headstone now had the correct addition because of Maya's work. There was a veteran who came in and simply sat among the medals, hands flat on the counter like a man touching the map of his youth. He said, in a voice that was mostly to himself, "That's where I was," and let the words rest on the air. The peer group moved entirely from scorn to respect. People who had once smirked now asked to help. They donated archival boxes, helped write lists, and took shifts manning the counter when Maya had to travel to a distant registry. They came to understand that expertise without humility could become something smaller than its intention. They learned, slowly, that objects were not merely tokens but obligations. Lionel faded into his lesser role with a stubbornness that made him watchful and quiet. He sent emails occasionally, corrective in tone, about a wording here and a classification there, as if attempting to reassert a vestigial supremacy by editing labels. No one paid much attention. He had been publicly shown that authority alone did not make truth. In the private hours, he wrote a small piece of regret in his journal, a note that read like the first steps of someone who might learn humility too late. Months followed with a steady rhythm. The shop expanded its hours out of necessity. Maya hired another assistant. She maintained a ledger of identifications that read like a small history of the town, the region, and the country in miniature. She never stopped being the person who loved objects for what they could say if they were listened to carefully. She did not become a museum director because she wanted to remain in the space where discovery felt intimate and immediate. She did become, in the eyes of many, a keeper of something vital. In the quiet months, she would sit after closing, the last of the customers gone and the display window dark except for the soft wash of a nearby streetlight. She would run her hand along the ledger and read names back in a voice that had learned to honor without show. Sometimes she would whisper a name aloud and imagine a scene from a life, a man marching to a ship, a woman writing a letter, a child baking a cake for a soldier who never came home. She kept her father's voice in memory. He would have been pleased that she had turned a private promise into a public correction. Honor, he had said, was quiet. She had honored that idea without fanfare. The shop had become a ritual place for those who wanted to remember and be remembered. It had also become a rebuke to Lionel's kind of bureaucratic pride. He had assumed the world belonged to those who could name and account for everything. Maya had taught a small community that the world also belonged to those who were willing to listen. In time, even Lionel's memory of the display softened. He would see it in articles or in the occasional photograph and feel the slow prickle of apology. There was a short, private letter he wrote to Maya, blandly courteous and unsigned by feeling, which she kept folded in a drawer because civilities were sometimes bridges worth keeping intact. The shop, the display, and the shrine continued. Maya did not stand at the center of an epic. She stood at the desk behind the counter where she could see faces come and go and where every day contained the tiny dramas of retrieval. Sometimes an old man would come in and sit silent, and Maya would not interrupt him because silence could be a kind of respect. Sometimes a child would ask a simple question, "What is this medal for?" and Maya would tell the story simply and with care. Once a year, on a sunny morning when flags lined the main street and the town smelled of hot coffee and new paint, the community gathered at the shop and read names. They placed small wreaths near photographs and spoke in the tonality of people who have learned to weigh words. They invited Dr. Hale and Colonel Royce and sometimes Lionel, though he rarely attended. The ceremony had no fanfare, no marching band, no politicized rhetoric. It was a naming and a returning, an act of community contrition and commitment. Maya stood in the back more than she stood in the front, and she liked it that way. In the end, the story was not about medals as objects but about names as claims on the present. Maya had been underestimated, as many women and collectors were underestimated. She had weathered derision that was public and private, and she had endured because the cause was not her vanity but a small principle she had learned from a man who fixed motors and kept his quiet. The arrogant gatekeeper had exposed his own limitations by trying to hold a key too tightly, and the higher authority, methodical, exacting, and willing to act, had corrected the imbalance. The peer group had shifted from scorn to respect, carrying with them a civic humility that was small but durable. The shrine in the window remained, not as a static place of victory but as an ongoing invitation. Names continued to appear in the ledger, and each time Maya set down a new one she felt the old warmth like a hand touching the back of her neck. She continued to honor the ways people disappeared and returned, and she did it without rhetoric and without need for applause. She had been publicly vindicated and privately appointed to a role she had always played, the quiet professional who made a place for the things that mattered. People now came and left with gratitude rather than suspicion, and the community had learned to be better custodians for the stories of those who had answered a call long ago and had been almost silent when they returned. Sometimes, when the sun made the metals glow in a particular way, she would think of the first box she had bought, of the widow who had shrugged and said she could not bear the chest of things any longer. She would think of a man who would be demoted by procedure and of a colonel who had arrived with a balanced hand. She would think of Dr. Hale and of the college kid who had learned to apologize properly. She would close the ledger and switch off the lights and walk home under the steady light of a town that had learned to remember. In the small hours she would hear, as if from a distance, the echo of the bell over the door and imagine the names on her tongue like a prayer. She closed the ledger and stood a moment longer, the last light pooling across the counter like an apology. Outside, late summer breathed warm and dry across the town, a low shimmer that softened edges and made iron look almost gentle. Inside, the shop smelled of lemon oil and old paper and the faint metallic tang of metals layered like shells in a drawer. Maya ran her thumb along the spiral binding until the silence felt less like absence and more like an ingredient. The shrine in the window caught her eye, the little cluster of objects, photographs, a folded flag, a rust-darkened dog tag, arranged with a care that belonged to people who treated memory like a living thing. She did not straighten it, she left it as it was, because the shrine belonged to whoever came seeking it, not to her. The ledger was different. The ledger was a record and a promise, it required tending. The bell over the door rang and she turned without surprise. A boy, too young for service but old enough to have the posture of someone who had been told to stand straight, stepped inside carrying a backpack that had seen better semesters. He moved like someone who measured what he said, his eyes were quick, polite, and guarded. "Evening," he said, voice thin with the kind of apprehension that is a dress rehearsal for courage. Are you Maya?" She nodded. "Depends who wants to be sure." He smiled faintly, a small concession. "My name is Caleb Ramos. Someone sent me. Dr. Hale, actually. Said you keep things safe." Dr. Hale, Maya repeated, storing the name with the exactness she had been taught, never confuse a voice with a face. "Sit. Tell me what you need." He perched on the stool as if it might bite. "It's my grandfather," he said. "He keeps, I guess, this box of stuff." He watched the funeral services on TV but never spoke about his time. His hands tightened on the strap of his backpack. "He asked me to bring it somewhere. He said he didn't want it thrown away when he couldn't look at it anymore." Maya glanced at the old wooden chest on the counter, the one with the bent latch Caleb had set down and left ajar as if to say, "Here is the invitation." The metal was pocked with tiny stars of rust, someone had once polished a circle to bare metal and then given up. A scout's braid of purple ribbon caught on the hinge. A couple of photographs peered out like curious witnesses. "Do you know his name?" Maya asked. Caleb fumbled for a crumpled scrap of paper. "Ramon Elias," he said. "Korea," they said. "Not sure which unit." "Bring it over here." She lifted the chest and set it on the glass case with a practiced motion that made the jewelry inside seem less fragile, as if a hand that had handled wrenches and wire could guarantee softness would not crack. Caleb watched as she opened the box, eyes widening in that particular way people get when they meet pieces of someone they love and never knew. Maya kept her hand steady. Inside were ribbons browned at the edges, a photograph of a young man in uniform with a cigarette half-smoked and still visible between two fingers, and a small, leather-smoothed Bible with a corner thumbed into a lover's crease. "This is why," Caleb began, voice shadowed. Maya looked at the photograph, then at Caleb. "He wanted it safe," she said. "You brought it here because you could not leave it in a closet. That is enough." Caleb exhaled, a thin little sound. "He said he trusted you. He said you know how to keep things that matter." The compliment should have been soft. Instead it landed like a stone in the hollow of her ribs. She did not explain, could not, without unspooling a thread she had tightened around herself for years. "We keep them," she said. "You can take the ledger entry." He hesitated, then reached for the pen. His hand trembled slightly. Life has a way of trembling when it confronts the tidy ease of ritual. He wrote the name slowly, the sound of the pen scratching across paper a kind of benediction. "Tell your grandfather," Maya said when he had finished, "that the ledger is not a witness so much as a promise. Names on paper are not enough, we have to remember through doing. Bring him back here when he wants to look. Bring him tea. Tell him the story of the photograph. Encourage him to put words to the things he can't bear alone." Caleb's eyes filled. "I will. Thank you." He left with a gratitude that was bigger than his shoulders could hold, and Maya watched him go with a stranger's small, furtive hope, an image of a boy telling an old man that he had done the right thing. It felt like an afterimage of the ledger itself, small acts holding a weight that, in the aggregate, steadied the town. After he left, she closed the chest and locked it with a simple, tidy click. Then she took a small paper bag from beneath the counter and set inside a plain biscuit and a tea bag marked chamomile, because certain acts of care cost nothing but yield much. She heard the sound of a car scratching to a stop across the street, the heavy moan of a truck's diesel cutting through the quiet. Footsteps approached the window. Maya watched a couple argue in muted gestures on the sidewalk and then break into quiet laughter. The town moved like a slow gear turning, children at a corner playing tag, a woman carrying groceries whose brow was freckled by sun, a mail carrier with a satchel smelling faintly of carbon paper. All of it ordinary, and in that ordinariness lay the steady counterpoint to what she did, keeping memory tender in a place where time otherwise simply ran. Night arrived with a cool hand. The shop's lamplight pooled like a watchful animal. Maya took down a small crate of metals she had been reluctant to polish earlier. She set them out on a cloth and began, methodically, to bring them back to life. Her motions had the rhythm of someone who understood torque and patience, the same gentle insistence she had taught recruits in other lives. As she worked, she thought about the man who had taught her how to file a ledger and wire a hinge and respect the weight of silence. His hands had been calloused, his fingers scarred with a map of small, exact injuries. He would have frowned at her care for the metals, and probably handed her the rag with a word about doing work that mattered without fuss. She smiled, a private crease. His voice lived inside directions, do it right, and the thing will tell you how to keep it. She had not known, could not have known, that his quiet code would become the scaffolding for an entire new life. It did not matter, one teaches as one was taught, and gratitude passes like coin. The door chimed again, but softer this time. A woman entered carrying a framed certificate wrapped in brown paper. She looked older than the boy, older than Maya had expected anyone to be who would seek a shop like this, and there was a deliberateness in the way she cradled the frame, as if it could bruise. "Good evening," the woman said. "I need help mounting this. It was my husband's. He wanted it kept safe. His name was Arthur Crawford. He taught at the school for 30 years. The brass is all wrong and—" Maya gestured to the workbench. "Sit. Tell me where the brass goes and what the certificate says." The woman peeled back the paper. The certificate was printed in a font that thought itself grander than the paper it lived on, which made the words feel more vulnerable. Maya read, "For 30 years of service, dedicated to the education of young minds, Arthur Crawford." The frame had once been varnished but was now mottled with sun and sweat. "He did wind up his students' clocks each year," the woman said. "He would tell them about the Civil War but never about himself. He kept quiet. He told me he was proud, but he would never have liked fuss." Maya smiled. "We don't do fuss here. We do careful." They worked in companionable silence, the woman offering soft, intermittent anecdotes about Arthur, how he used to leave notes for the janitor with trilby jokes, how he kept a jam jar of unused paper clips because they were useful in a strike. "He taught me to read the back of a watch," the woman said, her voice light with affection. "He showed me one day how a minute hand is a promise and you honor it by being present." Maya listened and, between tightening a corner and polishing a mat, she told a short, measured story about a veteran who had come in once with a watch that had stopped. She had taken the back off and found a scrap of letter tucked inside the case, a note to a son that had never been sent. They had sealed it into the ledger together. Sometimes, she said, we just set things where they will be found by someone who needs them. That is as much keeping as anything a medal does. The woman placed her hand over the frame. You keep them alive, she said. You do that work. Maya did not answer because the answer was not for praise. It was for keeping. She handed the finished frame back, the varnish warmed to a glow by the cloth. The woman hesitated at the door, then said, My daughter is joining a program upstate. Will you write her name in the ledger? Make sure someone knows where to find her things. She tried to laugh and failed. The anxiety under her voice was a tight string. Bring her by when she leaves, Maya said. We'll make a packet for her. Tell her to keep a postcard, she added, quietly, tell her it's okay to be anxious, being afraid of leaving doesn't mean you won't come back different. Sometimes you come back with more to offer. They exchanged a small, earnest look that contained gratitude, worry, and a private, shared understanding of how different kinds of leaving change people. When the woman left, the bell chimed like a punctuation mark. Later, when the lights were low and the town outside had folded into the hush of crickets and distant highway, Maya sat in the back room and catalogued the day's entries. The ledger had a new name, then another. At the margin of one page she found a slip of paper Caleb had left behind, handwriting that flinched between neat and uncertain. He had added a note, please call if my grandfather wants to talk. Maya put a checked mark beside it and made a mental list of who to call in the morning. Sleep came slowly and fitfully. When it finally arrived, it was not the raw collapse of exhaustion but the softer, more merciful blank that follows a long day of doing right. In her dreams the shrine in the window grew, not into a monument but into a hall of doors, each framed artifact a threshold. People moved through them without fanfare, an old man finding his photograph, a boy holding a veteran's scarf like a banner, a teacher returning a watch to the wrist of a student who had never known him. Names whispered like a hymn. She awoke before dawn to the sound of tires on wet pavement. Rain had come, a sudden, clean sheet of it that left the air smelling green and new. Light was a thin gray, the kind that reveals the world without flattering it. She dressed, wrapped her scarf, and opened the shop to the damp, working the brass key with fingers that remembered exact pressures. The first to arrive was a courier from the hospital with a request to pick up a chest of items belonging to a woman in palliative care. The second was a small cadre of cadets from the nearby academy who needed assistance with a memorial plaque for a lost training aircraft, an assignment that, by policy, could not be undertaken by the academy staff but could be granted to a civilian contractor. They shuffled in with an awkward sort of reverence, badges bright and shoes shined, eyes switching between formal respect and adolescent curiosity. Their leader was a girl with a haircut shaved enough at the sides to look rebellious and a posture that had been taught to hold back excitement. She said, Maya, sir, then corrected herself, flush with a heat that betrayed the respect she meant to show. Ms. Wren, she said finally, as if a compromise had been struck. Ms. Wren is fine, Maya said. You're early. They presented a file with the stiff, officious politeness cadets learn as armor. The plaque would be unveiled during the Academy's autumn parade. They needed the plaque's lettering carefully re-inked, the names had to be exact, in sequence. One of our instructors insists, the cadet said, looking at Maya as if she were an instrument to be tuned. He says someone who knows how to, she stopped, searching for the right word. Keep things honest, Maya supplied. The cadets laughed in a crisp, professional way that turned to silence when she nodded. Yes. Come back tomorrow, she told them. Bring the draft. We'll lay the lettering and check the spacing. Names deserve to be legible. They filed out with the file like a sacrament. The sound of their footsteps carried down the street and faded into the rain. Maya turned back to the counter and found, tucked under a coffee stain, a thin index card with a note in a compact, cursive hand. It read, Colonel Avery will be in town next week. She has questions. A small prickle of anticipation threaded through her. Colonel Avery had been one of the figures who had visited the shop after the reckoning, a presence like a clear bell. She had arrived precise and unsmiling and had asked direct questions that seemed to look for the truth like a compass. The town found her intimidating because she had the economy of a person who did not waste words. Maya had liked her for exactly that reason. She made a note on her calendar and then began to prepare the shop for the day's work. There were more chests under the counter, more requests piled like soft stones, a set of uniforms needing gentle mending, a box of letters whose envelopes had been chewed at the edges by damp, an old pilot scarf that smelled of oil and long roads. Each item had a voice. Maya moved through them like a listener, not only cataloging but translating. A rusted clasp became a story of hands that fixed engines, a damp letter became an argument for courage, a faded flag became a map of loyalty. By mid-morning the bell rang again and an older man came in, hair white, shoulders bent not with age but with the weight of decisions. He moved slowly, measuredly, but his eyes had a remarkable clarity. He introduced himself as Major Elliot Hale, Dr. Hale's brother, Maya realized with a small lurch, and he carried a battered duffel he set on the counter with the reverence of someone who had carried heavier things and had decided to set them down. Maya, he said, and the name between them was a thing with edges. Dr. Hale told me you would be a safe place. He said you do more than catalog. We do what the things demand, Maya replied. Elliot unfolded the duffel. Inside lay a jumble of photographs, a war journal with its spine unstitched, and a pocketknife that looked like it had been slept with once or twice. He watched her as she gently sorted the contents. You did right by him, he said finally, speaking of Dr. Hale though the sentence might have been about more. He trusted you. Maya thought of Dr. Hale's face, of the first time he had walked into the shop with the hesitant courage of a man offering a debt. He told me once, she said, handling a photograph of a field at dusk, that memory is not a box you close. It is an action. It requires tending. Elliot smiled, a brief thing like sun behind cloud. Then tend, he said. Will you take these? I want them kept together. And if you ever need to find me for something, he reached into his coat and produced a small card with a number on it, the kind of number that belonged to a life of movement. Call. I'm in Jocelyn most of the week. She took the card. It was practical, like a rope tossed down when the climb gets rough. I will, she said. He left with the soft cadence of a man who had given something away without regret. The shop felt fuller. The ledger would get its names and its margins that day, and her hands would be busy and content as a body should be when it is useful. Outside, the rain let up and the street steamed, the heat rising in the way old towns do after a downpour. People returned to their errands, their lives that were not centered on keepsakes and memory but which, because of those keepsakes and that memory, carried on with a slight new lilt, an awareness, small and human, that attention mattered. Maya arranged the items from the duffel in a box marked with Elliot's neat handwriting, Hale, Elliot. She slid the lid on and set it beneath the counter where it would be safe from sun and the tendency of curious fingers. The ledger awaited, its pages thirsty with space. She turned to a fresh sheet and picked up the pen, the weight of the instrument familiar and reassuring. She wrote the names that needed writing, one neat, one slanting, several threaded together with small notes, and for each name she paused a fraction, letting the sound of it settle like a bell. The act was small. The care was not. The day folded into the slow, inexorable softening that marks the verge of evening. Lamps went up in windows across the street and people slowed their steps as if the light itself directed pace. Maya shut the back door that leads to the alley and turned to the front where the shrine in the window glowed in the lamplight. Outside, a young couple passed holding hands, silhouettes bright against the dark. Inside, the medals shone and the ledger lay open, a little map of good deeds and the names that had claimed them. She did not know that, across town, a different set of gears had started to turn, the kind that would bring visitors with badges and questions, the kind that would remind memory that justice had a form it would soon take. For now, the shop was a quiet center, and Maya was a hinge. She rooted herself in the tasks of the evening, polishing, writing, sealing envelopes. The scent of lemon oil rose and braided with chamomile and paper, and in that aroma there was a peace that was practical and resolute. She paused and looked at the ledger, at the neat row of entries that made a small, imperfect map. It was enough to keep going. It would be enough tomorrow. The rest of the world, its reckonings, its consequences, could wait until morning.